The night unfolded like an opulent dream, draped in a velvet sky glittering with constellations. Beneath this celestial grandeur, the world's most powerful figures gathered in a palace of light and music, an architectural marvel where gold-trimmed columns soared toward the heavens and crystal chandeliers shimmered like captured stars. Tonight was no ordinary night. It was a night of legends, a night where wealth and influence did not merely exist but reigned supreme. At the heart of this spectacle stood Jackson, a band whose very name had become synonymous with transcendence. Their music was not merely sound, it was an art form that wove itself into the fabric of time, shaping history, dictating culture, and stirring the souls of those who dared to dream. And now in this sacred temple of luxury, they would perform for an audience unlike any other. An assembly of monarchs without crowns, rulers of industries, and architects of empires. The Grand Hall was a masterpiece of decadence, a place where elegance was not just displayed, but celebrated. Men of immeasurable power stood poised in tailored suits that bore the mark of the world's finest artisans. Their wristwatches were more than timepieces. They were declarations of status, encrusted with diamonds that caught the light in fleeting whispers of extravagance. Their presence alone commanded the air, an unspoken competition simmering beneath carefully measured nods and the glint of knowing smiles. Beside them, the women were visions of unattainable grace, their gowns cascading in rippling silks and whispering satins. Each dress, a poetic fusion of artistry and excess, embraced their forms like the loving hands of the world's most esteemed designers. Clutched delicately in their manicured hands were handbags that bore the insignia of heritage and exclusivity, each a silent proclamation of their standing. Their laughter, melodic yet calculated, flitted through the air like the soft chiming of crystal, a sound that both charmed and dominated. And then there were the children, ethereal beings sculpted by fate itself. With porcelain skin kissed by an otherworldly glow, with eyes that held galaxies within them, they moved like celestial spirits blessed with perfection from the moment they first drew breath. Their beauty was not one that needed to be adorned, it was a birthright, an unspoken privilege woven into their very existence. They were the heirs to untold fortunes, destined to inherit not just wealth, but the reins of the world itself. A symphony of murmurs filled the vast hall, subdued conversations draped in veiled intentions, the clinking of delicate champagne flutes catching the golden light, the subtle rustle of couture gowns sweeping against marble floors. But then suddenly, a hush. The chandeliers dimmed, surrendering their brilliance to the stage that now stood bathed in an ethereal glow. A single beam of light swept across the vastness, illuminating the presence of the legends who were about to perform. The air grew electric, charged with a tension so thick it could be felt, as if the very universe had paused to bear witness to this moment. And then, in that fleeting breath of silence, Jackson began. An evening of elegance, slowly unraveling. The scent of aged wine and gourmet delicacies filled the air, blending with the soft hum of classical music that floated gently through the grand hall. Laughter rippled through the crowd, light, effortless, the kind that came from people who had nothing to worry about. The world outside might have been chaotic, but in here everything was perfect. Seated at their tables, guests indulged in the finest cuisines prepared by world-renowned chefs. Each dish was a masterpiece plated with precision, each sip of champagne a luxurious escape. Conversations flowed smoothly, accompanied by the occasional clink of crystal glasses. A sense of comfort and ease wrapped around the room like a silk embrace, warm and intoxicating. And tonight, amidst this grandeur, a new generation had been invited to witness it all. The children, beautiful, impeccably dressed, and undeniably privileged, had not been brought here simply for the sake of company. No, their presence served a purpose. Their parents, titans of industry and architects of power, had long understood that the world they ruled was not just about wealth. It was about relationships, about connections forged over whispered deals and shared luxuries. And so, their children had to learn. From the moment they could walk and talk, they were introduced to this world of silent negotiations and unspoken hierarchies. They were taught the art of the perfect handshake, the importance of an elegant smile, the ability to command attention without ever raising their voices. Tonight was a lesson, a carefully orchestrated introduction to the world they were destined to inherit. At first, their presence blended seamlessly into the ambiance of refined sophistication. They moved among the guests with the practiced grace their parents had instilled in them, their cherubic faces lighting up with carefully rehearsed politeness. Some clung to their parents' sides, absorbing the rhythm of high society, while others, more emboldened, ventured to introduce themselves to fellow heirs and heiresses. For a while it all went according to plan, but then, almost imperceptibly at first, something shifted. A soft giggle floated through the air, delicate, innocent, almost charming. Then another. A group of children dressed in impeccable miniature versions of their parents' finery began to drift away from their designated spaces. Their wide, curious eyes scanned the grand hall, their small hands twitching with a restless energy that had no place in a gathering of dignitaries and power brokers. At first, their presence was a delightful contrast. Little angels with cherubic faces, their laughter a sweet, harmless melody that added a playful undercurrent to the evening's sophistication. Some of the guests even smiled indulgently, amused by their youthful innocence amidst the rigid decorum. Then one of them, perhaps emboldened by the lack of reprimand, reached out and plucked a single, glistening grape from an untouched silver platter. Another followed, dipping a small, mischievous hand into a golden bowl of sugared almonds. The adults noticed, of course, but their reaction was mild amusement rather than disapproval. After all, these were no ordinary children. They were heirs to empires, born into privilege so absolute that even rules seemed optional. But what began as harmless curiosity quickly took on a life of its own. A fork clattered onto the marble floor, the sharp sound cutting through the soft symphony of murmured conversation. A young boy, his eyes bright with mischief, decided that the intricate floral centerpiece before him would make an excellent toy. With a delighted laugh, he pulled at a delicate vine of orchids, sending petals cascading onto the pristine tablecloth. Another child, emboldened by the spectacle, seized a linen napkin and twisted it into a makeshift slingshot. With a triumphant flick of his wrist, he launched a perfectly folded napkin into the air. It arched gracefully, drifting through the golden glow of the chandeliers before landing, with unfortunate precision, in the lap of a dignified CEO. A ripple of mild discomfort spread through the room. Conversations faltered, eyes flickered toward the growing commotion, yet no one spoke. The air grew tense, a delicate balance between patience and irritation. But still, no one intervened. After all, these were the children of kings and titans, too precious to scold, too privileged to restrain. And so the unraveling continued. The veteran's warning. Ryan stood at his post near the edge of the grand hall, his sharp eyes scanning the glittering sea of wealth and privilege. Unlike the men in tailored suits, sipping aged whiskey, and the women draped in silks that flowed like liquid gold, he was dressed in a simple black security uniform, functional, unremarkable, meant to blend into the background. The fabric stretched taut over his broad shoulders, his posture straight and disciplined, a habit drilled into him long before he had ever stood in a place like this. His face was lined, not with age but with experience, hard-earned wisdom carved into the creases near his eyes, the faint scar running along his cheekbone. His left sleeve was folded and pinned neatly at the shoulder, hiding the place where his arm had once been. The absence no longer pained him, but it never let him forget. Ryan was a soldier once. He had stood in deserts where the heat could melt steel, in jungles where death hid behind every shadow. He had known chaos, real chaos, the kind that came with gunfire and blood, not champagne and whispered gossip. And yet somehow the noise that was now rising in the hall felt almost familiar. Laughter, sharp, high-pitched, uncontrolled. The sound of something heavy tipping over, a glass shattering. His gaze snapped toward the source, the children. At first they had been well-mannered, staying close to their parents, exchanging polite nods with other heirs to unimaginable fortunes. But as the night stretched on and the adults became more engrossed in their conversations, discussing power moves, corporate empires, and secret deals, the children had slipped from their grasp. Dressed in miniature versions of their parents' attire, they looked like little porcelain dolls at first glance, flawless, delicate, untouchable. but their eyes gleamed with mischief, and their smiles held no innocence, only the boldness of those who had never been told no. One boy, barely 10 years old, had discovered that the perfectly folded cloth napkins could be twisted into slingshots. He launched sugar-coated almonds across the hall, aiming at the back of unsuspecting guests' heads. Another had taken off his polished leather shoes and was now sliding across the glossy marble floor, laughing wildly as he nearly crashed into a waiter balancing a tray of champagne. A girl in a shimmering dress had climbed onto an empty chair, reaching for the elaborate floral centerpiece. The delicate crystal vase wobbled dangerously as her fingers wrapped around the silk petals. When she yanked a handful free, a cascade of water spilled onto the table, soaking the pristine tablecloth and sending white orchid petals floating like fallen snow. Ryan exhaled slowly. Not my job. His duty was to watch for threats, to ensure the safety of the event. But even now he could see the shifting expressions on the guests' faces. Some were still amused, offering indulgent smiles at the children's antics. Others were less entertained, small frowns, subtle glances exchanged, whispers behind jeweled fingers. The line between harmless fun and embarrassing disruption was beginning to blur. Ryan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bark orders. Years of experience had taught him that true authority didn't come from volume, it came from presence. He approached a young boy standing near the dessert table, his small hand reaching for a chocolate-covered strawberry, just as a waiter was about to place the last delicate arrangement of pastries. The boy's fingers hesitated mid-air when he noticed Ryan's shadow loom over him. "Excuse me, young man," Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's keep it down a little, all right? We don't want to disturb the guests." The child blinked up at him, momentarily caught off guard. For a brief moment, Ryan thought he might actually listen. Then a voice cut through the air. "This is a party," another boy declared. Ryan turned slightly, his eyes landing on William. Golden-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that likely cost more than Ryan had made in a month, William exuded an air of effortless superiority. He was the type of child who had never been denied anything, whose entire life had been paved with red carpets and quiet whispers of, "He's special," from those around him. William crossed his arms, a smirk pulling at his lips. "We can do whatever we want." Ryan met his gaze evenly. He had seen this look before, not in children, but in men who commanded armies, in officers who had grown so accustomed to power that they no longer recognized authority in anyone but themselves. "A party, yes," Ryan replied evenly, "but that doesn't mean you can disrupt everyone else." The boy tilted his head, considering this. The other children watched, waiting to see what he would do. William's smirk widened, as if he had just thought of something particularly clever. Without another word, he spun on his heel and bolted toward his parents. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Here we go." Across the hall, William's father, one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in the world, was deep in conversation when his son came barreling into his side, tugging at his sleeve with dramatic urgency. "Daddy, that man won't let us play." The words cut through the hum of polite conversation like a blade. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. Some guests exchanged amused glances, while others merely watched in silence, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Ryan remained where he stood, his expression unreadable. He had faced enemy fire, walked through minefields, and seen the kind of destruction most men could not imagine. And yet, somehow, in this room full of kings without crowns, he knew this was the kind of battlefield where men like him never won. Clash of power and pride. Ryan stood his ground as the murmurs spread through the crowd, his expression unreadable. He had been in enough situations like this to recognize when trouble was brewing, not the kind that involved bullets and explosions, but the quieter, more insidious kind. Through the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, a man stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. John. He was tall, immaculately dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, never been denied anything in his life. His cufflinks gleamed under the chandelier's golden light, and the watch on his wrist, likely worth more than a house, caught the reflection of the grand hall's opulence. He didn't look angry, not yet. He looked amused, as if what was unfolding before him was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a trivial game he was about to win. Placing a hand on his son's shoulder, John cast a brief glance at William, whose smug expression confirmed that he had already won the first move. Then he turned his gaze to Ryan, eyes cold, calculating. "I assume you're the one who thought it was appropriate to scold my son?" John's voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that had closed billion-dollar deals and dictated the futures of lesser men. Ryan met his gaze evenly. He had dealt with warlords and commanders who thought they were untouchable. This man was no different. "I didn't scold him," Ryan said plainly. "I asked him to keep the noise down. This is a formal event, not a playground." John exhaled sharply, a humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "A formal event, you say?" He gestured around. "I see people laughing, drinking, enjoying themselves. My son was simply expressing himself. Isn't that what these gatherings are for? To build connections? To socialize?" Ryan kept his voice steady. "There's a difference between socializing and disrupting an entire event." He nodded toward the other guests. Some were still pretending not to listen, while others openly watched, waiting to see where this confrontation would lead. "If the children aren't reminded of that, someone else will." John's expression darkened slightly, his amusement thinning at the edges. "And you think that someone is you?" He let out another quiet chuckle. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Ryan squared his shoulders, his posture unshaken. "I'm the man responsible for making sure this event runs smoothly. If that means asking your son to behave, then yes, I'm that someone." That was the moment John's amusement fully cracked, giving way to something uglier. His lips curled in a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, his voice dipping into something more condescending. "You must be confused, soldier," he sneered, deliberately emphasizing the word like it was an insult. "You're here to stand in the corner and make sure no one gets in without an invitation, not to lecture children of real men." A few murmurs rose from the crowd. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, while others smirked, entertained by the unfolding humiliation. Ryan felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't move. He had been called worse, much worse. John took a step closer, his voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "Let me make something clear to you, security boy. You do not have the authority to tell my son what he can or cannot do. In fact, you don't have the authority to tell anyone here anything. You're just a broken relic from a war nobody cares about, wearing a cheap uniform in a room full of men who could buy and sell your entire existence." Ryan remained silent, but his fingers curled slightly at his side. And then, like vultures circling fresh prey, other parents began stepping forward. "He's right," one man scoffed, his diamond-studded watch glinting as he waved dismissively. "Who does this man think he is, telling our children what to do?" A woman in a floor-length silk gown shook her head, her voice laced with disdain. "This is why events like this shouldn't let just anyone work security. It ruins the atmosphere." Another man laughed cruelly. "Look at him, half a man, half a job. Who let a cripple tell the sons of billionaires how to behave?" The words hit hard, but Ryan didn't flinch. He had faced real enemies, real battles. This question mark, this was just noise. John, sensing his growing advantage, pressed forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's be honest here," he said, flashing a condescending smile. "Men like you don't belong in places like this. You're nothing more than a glorified servant, a piece of decoration meant to keep the undesirables out." "A nobody?" The final word was a dagger, cutting through the tension like a blade. Ryan's grip tightened ever so slightly. His instincts screamed at him to act, to respond, to put this man in his place. But he knew better. He had survived battlefields where the wrong move meant death. He had learned when to strike and when to endure. And right now, in a room full of people who saw him as less than human, striking back wouldn't win him anything. So he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He stood there and took it. And in that silence, in his refusal to lash out, he won a different kind of battle. Because while John smirked, believing himself victorious, Ryan saw something else in the eyes of a few watching guests. Shame. Not everyone here was blind to the cruelty unfolding before them. Not everyone found amusement in tearing down a man who had given his arm for a country that barely acknowledged his sacrifice. And that, Ryan knew, was worth more than a fight he couldn't win. For now, divided loyalties, Ryan took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. His years in the military had taught him patience, discipline, and how to hold his ground even in the face of hostility. He had been in war zones where survival depended on keeping a cool head under fire. This wasn't a battlefield, but the enemies here carried weapons of a different kind: wealth, power, and entitlement. Even now, as the tension in the air thickened, he reminded himself, this is not a fight worth losing control over. He straightened his posture and spoke clearly, his voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan addressed the gathering, this is a formal event, and there are certain expectations of behavior that we all must respect. I was simply ensuring that everyone here can enjoy their evening without unnecessary disruptions. That is my duty. But no one was really listening. Instead, many of the parents had begun subtly pulling their children away, shielding them as if they were protecting them from some unsightly display of conflict. Ryan wasn't the threat, but to these people, he might as well have been. A man standing his ground against the powerful was something they did not want their children to witness. A woman in a diamond-studded gown whispered to her husband, shaking her head disapprovingly. "This is exactly why security should remain unseen," she muttered. "What an embarrassing scene." Another man exhaled, tapping the rim of his champagne glass impatiently. "A security guard trying to educate us on etiquette? How ridiculous." Jonathan watched all of this with satisfaction, his smirk widening. "Oh, listen to this," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "The help is giving us a lecture on manners." Laughter rippled through the group, quiet but sharp. Ryan kept his expression neutral. He had been insulted before. He had been called worse. But he also knew that not everyone in this room agreed with Jonathan. A distinguished older man, standing among the guests, cleared his throat. His voice was calm but firm. "Jonathan, you're making a scene," he said. "The security officer is simply doing his job. If you can't control your son, then at the very least, you should respect the people who are maintaining order." A woman in an elegant silk dress nodded in agreement. "He's right. This man has served his country, and now he's serving this event. The least we can do is show some courtesy." Some of the guests murmured in quiet agreement, but others weren't so quick to take Ryan's side. A businessman scoffed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Come on, this is ridiculous. This is supposed to be an evening of elegance, not some moral debate about respect and working-class values." A younger man leaned in, smirking. "Honestly, I'd rather just get back to my drink." Then someone turned to Ryan and said bluntly, "Maybe it's best if you just leave." A ripple of silence passed through the crowd, but before Ryan could respond, another voice cut through the room. "No." The same older gentleman from before narrowed his eyes at the group. "Jonathan is the one who should be leaving." The air grew heavier. Jonathan's jaw tightened. For the first time in his life, someone was openly challenging his authority, and he couldn't stand it. Jonathan had never known struggle, never known resistance. He was born into power, raised to believe that the world existed for him to command. No one had ever told him no. No one had ever stood their ground against him, until now. And the fact that it was a security guard, a man who he considered beneath him, was unbearable. His hands clenched into fists, his face reddening with frustration. He couldn't lose here, not in front of all these people. So instead, he did what he always did. He tried to crush the opposition. Jonathan turned to Ryan, his voice rising, no longer refined, no longer controlled. Instead, it was loud, crude, and borderline hysterical. "Do you think you matter here?" Jonathan shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. Guests turned, eyes widening. Some took a step back, sensing that Jonathan was losing control. "You are nothing," he continued, pointing a shaking finger at Ryan. "Just a pathetic one-armed veteran pretending he still has some purpose in life." The words were venomous, cruel, meant to wound. Some guests gasped. Others turned away, uncomfortable. But Ryan? Ryan didn't even blink. Jonathan wanted a reaction. He wanted to see Ryan break. But Ryan had survived war. He had survived losing a limb. He had survived far worse than the tantrum of a spoiled billionaire. So instead, he just stared, calm, unshaken. And that silence was what truly humiliated Jonathan. Because Jonathan realized Ryan wasn't afraid of him. And nothing terrified a man like Jonathan more than the idea of someone who refused to be controlled. But Jonathan, blinded by rage, wasn't ready to back down. He needed to win. So he threw out his final, most desperate insult. "You are just a damn slave, standing here pretending to be something you're not." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that made even the chandeliers seem dimmer. Ryan's fingers twitched slightly, the first real movement he had made in the past few minutes. He exhaled. Slowly. Then he took one step forward. Jonathan instinctively took half a step back. Ryan didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't even raise his voice. But when he spoke, the room felt smaller. "I have fought beside men who gave their lives for this country," Ryan said, voice steady, controlled. "I have seen real power, real honor." He tilted his head slightly, his piercing gaze locked onto Jonathan's now pale face. "And let me tell you something, Mr. Callahan." Ryan's voice dropped lower, the weight of his words pressing down like steel. "You wouldn't last a day in my world." Jonathan's breath hitched, and in that moment he knew Ryan was right. Ryan didn't need money, didn't need titles, because true power wasn't in wealth, it was in presence. And Jonathan had just lost every ounce of his. The voice that commanded silence. The music came to an abrupt halt. The once harmonious melody, which had filled the grand hall with elegance and sophistication, was now replaced by a deafening silence. The absence of sound was more jarring than the chaos itself, as if the entire event had lost its rhythm, thrown off by the commotion near the back of the room. And then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough!" The single word echoed across the hall, amplified by the microphone. It wasn't shouted, yet it carried a weight that settled heavily over the room, demanding attention without force, only presence. Jason Calloway, the lead singer of Jackson, a global icon, a name that resonated across continents. He wasn't just a performer, he was a force, a man who had transcended the stage and become something greater, an influencer, a visionary, a voice people listened to. And right now, his voice was law. A ripple of silence followed as all eyes turned toward the stage, where Jason stood with the microphone still in his hand. His tall frame was poised, his expression unreadable beneath the sharp lighting. The once casual air of an artist lost in his performance was gone. Now he was in control. Jason descended from the stage, each step measured and deliberate, the spotlight shifting with him. His deep blue eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the source of the disturbance. He didn't need to raise his voice again. His presence alone was enough to command obedience. The guests who had been whispering, laughing, or exchanging scandalous glances moments ago suddenly found themselves caught in the weight of his gaze. Even Jonathan Callahan, still bristling from his own fury, remained uncharacteristically still. But Jason wasn't looking at him. His eyes had landed on Ryan, and everything changed. At first it was just recognition, not of the man, but of the shape of him, the squared shoulders, the rigid stance, the way he held himself even in the face of insults and degradation. But then Jason's gaze drifted downward, and he saw it, the empty sleeve. Something inside Jason lurched. His breath hitched, just for a second, so fleeting no one else might have noticed. But he felt it, a sharp, invisible punch to the gut, a rush of emotions, tangled and unexpected, rising in his chest like an old wound being ripped open. Because he had seen this before, because this was familiar, his father. The image of the man who had raised him flooded his mind with brutal clarity. The same disciplined posture, the same quiet resilience, and, most haunting of all, the same sacrifice. Jason's hands clenched around the microphone, knuckles turning white. He had spent years trying to separate himself from that part of his past. Not because he was ashamed, but because it hurt. Because every memory of his father before the war was different from the man who had returned home. The man who had walked through their front door with one less leg than when he had left. The man who had once stood strong and unshaken, now struggling with things that once came effortlessly. The man who had never spoken about the pain, never asked for pity, never allowed himself to show weakness. The man who had taught Jason everything he knew about strength. And now standing before him was another man, one who had walked the same path, borne the same burdens, carried the same unspoken weight. Jason swallowed, his throat tightening. The golden glow of the chandeliers, the polished floors, the murmuring elite, all of it faded into the background. All he could see was his father, and now this man. The microphone in Jason's grip lowered slightly as he stepped closer. The air between them was thick, charged with something unspoken, understanding, recognition, something neither of them needed to explain. When he finally spoke, Jason's voice had changed. It was no longer the commanding tone of an artist silencing a crowd. It was quieter, personal. "Are you a veteran?" Ryan hesitated. There was a shift in him, not of fear, but of caution, like a soldier assessing whether the question was a threat or if it was safe to answer. Then slowly he gave a small nod. Jason exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. And then something happened that no one expected. Jason, one of the most famous men in the world, an artist adored by millions, a man who had shared stages with royalty and presidents, stepped forward and extended his hand. Not out of pity, not out of superiority, but out of respect. For a long moment, Ryan didn't move. He looked at Jason's hand, then up at his face as if searching for something. Doubt, mockery, insincerity. But there was none. Jason knew. Because Jason had seen this before. Because Jason had lived with it. And because, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was that recognition. It was the kind of respect no amount of money could buy. The kind that came only from those who understood what it meant to give up a piece of yourself for something greater. And for the first time that evening, Ryan didn't feel invisible. Slowly he reached out and shook Jason's hand. A silent message passed between them, one no one else in the room could understand. But it didn't matter, because in that moment, they understood each other. And for Ryan, that was enough. A voice that echoed through time. Jason stood still for a moment, his fingers tightening around the microphone as he let out a slow, measured breath. The silence in the room was thick, the kind of silence that didn't just fill space but carried weight. Without another word, he turned sharply and strode back toward the stage. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step deliberate, carrying an intensity that made the air feel electric. He ascended the steps quickly, then turned to face the crowd once more, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with something raw. He wasn't just a performer anymore. He was a man with something to say. Raising the microphone, his voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Before we continue," Jason began, "I'd like to take a moment to share something with all of you." A murmur passed through the audience, shifting uneasily. This was unexpected. This was not part of the evening's schedule. But no one interrupted, because Jason Calloway had the floor. He let his gaze drift over the sea of opulence before him, the wealthy elites, the polished heirs, the power brokers who had spent their lives shielded from the very things he was about to speak of. Then his eyes found Jonathan Callahan, and his blood boiled. Jason's voice hardened, laced with an anger he didn't bother to hide. "Tell me, Jonathan," he said, his words slicing through the silence, "what does war mean to you?" Jonathan, still stiff from their earlier encounter, blinked in surprise. "I—" Jason didn't let him finish. "Do you even know?" Jason's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. "Do you have the slightest idea what it means to fight, to bleed, to lose everything, just so that others, people like you, can sit in comfort, enjoying the world that was paid for in blood?" A ripple of unease spread across the hall. Jason didn't stop. "Tell me, Jonathan," he demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "Do you think your empire, your father's fortune, your family name, your comfortable little kingdom, would even exist if men like him," Jason gestured toward Ryan, "hadn't fought for it?" Jonathan clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. For the first time that evening, he had no words. Jason exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. War, he continued, his voice lower now, but no less intense, is not some abstract idea. It is not a story in history books or a headline you scroll past on your phone. It is real, it is brutal, and it is paid for by the lives of men who never come home. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself, but the fire inside him only burned hotter. He hadn't planned on saying any of this, but now standing here, he had to. His grip on the microphone tightened as he spoke again, this time with a different kind of emotion. My father was one of those men. A hush fell over the room. Jason swallowed hard, the memories washing over him, raw and unfiltered. He had never spoken about this in public, never allowed himself to be vulnerable about something so deeply personal. But now he needed them to understand. My father, he continued, his voice steady but filled with something heavy, was a soldier, a man who left behind everything he knew, his home, his family, his future, to fight in a war he never asked for. He went because it was his duty, because he believed in something greater than himself. Jason's gaze dropped for a brief second, lost in the weight of memory. When he left, he was strong, he said quietly. When he came back, he was missing a leg. A few gasps broke the silence. Jason let the words hang there, let them sink in. He never spoke about what happened out there, Jason continued, his voice tight with emotion. Not in detail, but I saw it in his eyes. The things he'd lost, the ghosts that followed him home. He looked back at Jonathan, his jaw tightening again. And yet, Jason said, his voice sharp, despite everything, despite the pain, the struggle, the nights spent staring at the ceiling because the memories wouldn't let him sleep, he never once complained. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. He never demanded recognition, never asked for thanks. He just carried it, because that's what men like him do. Jason turned his gaze to Ryan now. His voice softened. They don't ask for pity. They don't expect applause. They just carry it. Ryan's face remained stoic, unreadable. But his eyes said everything. Jason inhaled deeply before looking back at the crowd. And yet, here we are, he said bitterly, in a room full of people who reap the benefits of their sacrifices, but don't even have the decency to show respect. His voice dropped lower, but somehow it felt louder. That is the real disgrace. Silence. A deep, uncomfortable silence. No one spoke. No one dared to. Jonathan's face was pale, his mouth pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Because what could he say? Jason looked over the room one last time, letting his words linger. Then stepping back, he adjusted his grip on the microphone. Now, he said finally, voice even once more, if you'll excuse me, I have a song to finish. With that, he turned and walked back toward the center of the stage. But something had changed. The performance wouldn't be the same, because now the entire room knew the weight of the words he was about to sing, and no one would hear them the same way again. A song for the forgotten. The silence in the grand hall was no longer one of discomfort, but of reverence. The room, once filled with whispers, mockery, and meaningless chatter, now stood still, as if frozen in time. Every pair of eyes was locked onto the stage, onto the man who had just shattered their comfortable ignorance with words that carried the weight of generations. Jason took a deep breath. His gaze flickered to Ryan, who still stood firm, composed but undeniably changed by the moment. Then Jason did something no one expected. He extended a hand. Join me, he said, his voice carrying across the hall, steady but inviting. Ryan stiffened slightly, instinctively glancing toward the guests who had insulted him just minutes ago. Some of them still bore expressions of quiet contempt, others of unease, but many looked uncertain, their arrogance faltering under the weight of Jason's words. For a long moment, Ryan didn't move. Then with a slow, measured breath, he reached out and took Jason's hand. A ripple of surprise spread through the audience as Jason led Ryan up the steps of the stage. He wasn't just pulling a veteran into the spotlight. He was forcing an entire room of privileged elites to acknowledge him. When they reached the center of the stage, Jason turned back to the microphone. His grip on it was firm, his expression unreadable. Then, with the confidence of a man who had spent his life commanding the attention of thousands, he spoke. "I want everyone here to listen carefully," Jason said, his voice unwavering. "Tonight we are gathered in luxury, in comfort, enjoying an event that exists because of peace." He let that word sink in. "But peace doesn't just exist on its own," he continued, his voice deepening with emotion. "It was earned, it was fought for, and men like him," Jason gestured toward Ryan, "were the ones who paid the price." A pause, a heavy, suffocating pause. Jason turned slightly toward his bandmates, nodding once. Understanding the unspoken command, they moved back into position. A low hum of the keyboard filled the air, soft and steady, as the lights dimmed, casting a golden glow over the stage. Jason turned back to the audience. "I want to dedicate this next song to every soldier who ever fought for freedom," he said, "to those who returned broken, and to those who never returned at all, and most of all, to those who were forgotten." His eyes met Ryan's for a brief second. Then he began to sing. The war song. The first note hit like a whisper of the past, gentle but filled with the weight of memory. Jason's voice was raw, deep, carrying the sorrow of 1,000 battlefields. They marched under burning skies, with fire in their hearts and steel in their eyes. They fought for a land they called their own, but some would never make it home. The melody climbed, powerful yet sorrowful, a tribute to sacrifice. Ryan stood beside him, motionless. He had heard songs about war before, but never like this. Never one that understood, that felt like it had been sung by someone who had seen the same horrors, even if through different eyes. The chorus swelled, the band joining in, the music soaring with the weight of history. For the ones who stood when others fled, for the ones who bled but never begged, for the names forgotten, the graves left bare, we stand for you, we remember, we swear. Jason's voice was commanding, fierce, unstoppable. He sang for his father, for the countless men who had given their limbs, their youth, their lives, only to be cast aside by those too rich to care. He sang for Ryan, and this time the room did not ignore it. Some guests lowered their heads, ashamed. Others swallowed thickly, their hands tightening around their glasses as if to ground themselves. A few even looked toward Ryan, not with pity, but with genuine recognition. By the time Jason reached the final verse, his voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "So raise your glasses, not just for the kings, but for the soldiers, the nameless, the men with clipped wings. For they gave us the world we stand in today, and we owe them more than words can say." The final note hung in the air like a ghost, lingering long after Jason's voice had faded. Then, thunderous applause, not the forced, polite clapping of an audience at a high society event. Number this was real, loud, resounding, filled with emotion. People rose from their seats, some clapping, some wiping their eyes, others looking at Ryan with something resembling respect. Jason turned back to the microphone, his face unreadable, his chest rising and falling from the weight of his own emotions. Then he spoke again. "This man beside me," Jason said, his voice quieter now but filled with undeniable authority, "is a veteran, a man who has given more to this country than any of us in this room ever will." He turned his gaze back to Jonathan, whose face had gone pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "And yet, there are people in this room who dare to look down on him, who dare to call him lesser." Jason's voice hardened. "People who know nothing of history, nothing of sacrifice, nothing of what it truly means to earn your place in this world." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Jason let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "So I ask you all," he continued, his voice softer now, but cutting deeper than ever. "Will you stand here, drowning in your own self-importance, pretending that the comforts you enjoy weren't built on the backs of men like him?" Another pause. "Or will you show respect?" The weight of his words hung over them like a verdict. Then, one by one, people began to stand. Some moved hesitantly at first, unsure, but then a ripple effect. First a few, then a dozen, then half the room. By the time the applause swelled again, the entire hall was on its feet. And this time, it wasn't for Jason, it was for Ryan, for every man who had been forgotten, for every sacrifice that had gone unnoticed. Jason exhaled slowly, then turned toward Ryan. "Tonight," he said softly, "we honor you." Ryan's throat tightened. He had fought in wars, he had faced death, but this was something he never expected. For the first time in years, he felt seen. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan Callahan was silent. A legacy to remember, Ryan stood motionless as the applause thundered around him, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. He wasn't a man easily moved. He had faced too much, lost too much. Recognition had never been something he sought. It was enough for him to know he had done his duty, that the sacrifices he and his brothers in arms had made were not in vain. But standing here, in front of a crowd that had once dismissed him, and now truly saw him, he felt something stir inside him, a warmth, a long-forgotten sense of belonging. Jason placed a firm hand on Ryan's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. Then turning back to the microphone, his voice rang out once more. "This moment," Jason said, "isn't just about tonight. It isn't just about one man or one event. It's about a truth that should never have been forgotten." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Our world moves so fast," he continued. "We innovate, we expand, we build fortunes. But in doing so, we forget. We forget the people who made all of this possible. The ones who fought, the ones who bled, the ones who never came back." The room was silent, hanging on to his every word. Jason exhaled softly, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "My father once told me," he said, "that the measure of a man isn't in how much wealth he accumulates, but in what he leaves behind." His gaze found Jonathan in the crowd. "And some of you," Jason said pointedly, "will leave behind nothing but greed, arrogance, and a legacy of looking down on those who made your lives possible." Jonathan's face was unreadable, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. Jason let the silence stretch, then turned to the rest of the room. "But for the rest of us," he continued, "we have a choice. We can choose to remember. We can choose to honor. We can choose to make sure that the next generation, our children, grow up knowing the price of the world they live in." Jason turned slightly, meeting Ryan's eyes. "We owe it to them," Jason said, his voice softer, "to make sure their sacrifices were not forgotten." Ryan held his gaze. Then slowly he nodded. Jason turned back to the audience. "So tonight," he said, "let this be the start of something different." He raised his glass, the golden liquid catching the light. "To the ones who fought, to the ones who fell, and to the ones who live on, carrying their legacy." There was a pause, a single profound moment of silence. Then one by one, glasses began to rise. At first just a few, then more, and then all of them. The entire room, once filled with those who had dismissed a man like Ryan, now stood united in a moment of reverence. Ryan's throat tightened, his fingers curling slightly at his side. He had stood at many memorials, had heard many tributes, but never, never had he expected one like this. Jason took a slow breath, looking out at the sea of raised glasses, then lifted his own higher. "To those who gave us everything," he said, and as the words echoed through the hall, Ryan did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled. A message for the future. As the night drew to a close, something had shifted. People who had once seen themselves as superior found themselves questioning their own arrogance. Conversations turned from business and status to history, sacrifice, and gratitude. Children who had once been allowed to run free without understanding the weight of their privilege now looked up at Ryan with something new in their eyes. Respect. Even Jonathan Callahan, once untouchable in his own ego, stood quietly at the edge of the room, a drink in his hand, his expression unreadable. He had lost tonight, not in wealth or power, but in something far deeper. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to react to it. Ryan, now standing near the entrance of the hall, watched all of this unfold. He had never needed recognition, never sought validation. But tonight, he had been given it, not because he had demanded it, but because one man had chosen to stand up and remind the world what mattered. As Jason stepped off the stage and approached him, Ryan nodded in quiet appreciation. "You didn't have to do that," Ryan murmured. Jason smiled faintly. "Yes, I did." Ryan exhaled, then extended his hand. Jason took it, firm, unwavering, a handshake not just of gratitude, but of understanding. And as Ryan turned to leave, walking into the night, Jason's voice echoed behind him. One final message, not just for the room, but for the future. Never forget those who fought for the world you stand in today. And as the doors closed behind Ryan, the stars above seemed just a little brighter. For tonight, history had been honored, and the future had been reminded.